was the connection between transgenderism, transhumanism, and Judaism? That's the line of thought I've been following the last few days. Just as some background, I've been looking into who funded, who is the elite that's sort of pushing the transgender agenda, why that's become an important agenda the last few years. There was one article I stumbled across that was quite well written by a TERF, a radical feminist that isn't too fond of the transgender stuff. And she was very scathing about the people behind it. But she did a good job identifying the people who have most sort of financed, funded, how they've done it, what initiatives they've used, how they've used educational institutions and so on. But the three people she primarily blamed were George Soros, Martine Rothblatt, and Jennifer Pritzker. And you may notice these all have something in common which kind of jumps out if you recognise the names. She said her attack on them was that they're all three white males, which isn't exactly true, obviously, because two of them are trans females. So she obviously misgendered them there, but they're obviously not white males for another reason as well. I don't think those people would really identify as white, but they're interesting characters. Jennifer Pritzker, formerly James Pritzker of the Pritzker family, which is worth like over $30 billion. They're a hugely powerful, influential family in the US. She transitioned in the early 2010s, and that's really when a lot of this stuff took off, when she really threw the force of her wealth and power behind it. But Martine Rothblatt is kind of a more interesting figure because she has been focusing on this agenda and trying to put it into the public view since the early 1990s. And she was like the author of, I forget the name of it, like an international like statement of gender rights or something, but some of these like international documents that were used to sort of frame the discussion around rights and gender-based discrimination and all this stuff. But she's interesting because she runs a company, a pharmaceutical company, and she's very much interested in transhumanism and augmentation and nanotechnology to extend life. She also runs actually Sirius FM or XM, you know, the radio station that Howard Stern was hosted on. And what's interesting is she wrote a book that kind of ties all this together. She wrote a book called From Transgender to Transhuman. And this is quite interesting because this is, I think, really the sort of the manifesto of the transgender movement, in that for her it's really not about discrimination. It's not about like another form of, like, you know, it's the next wave of, like, you know, they fixed gay rights discrimination, and then they fixed like whatever else, bisexual discrimination, and now like trans is next on the agenda. It's really more than that for her. Transgenderism for her has this kind of metaphysical significance rather than merely moral significance, because it's actually not about acceptance, it's about a fundamental transformation. It's not about accepting transgenderism as like another gender. It's about moving beyond gender. It's about moving to a post-gender world. And she even uses that kind of language. And it's intimately bound up with technology. You know, a lot of the book is her discussing how technology will make a post-gender world possible. You know, things like you can have non-gendered bathrooms because like they'll have technology, so like women can use urinals and all this weird stuff. But you know, it is interesting. It captures that mindset where all of these things, technology, sort of personal augmentation, LGBT, transgenderism, and this very progressive idea of like a transhuman singularity, how all of these things kind of come together. And you know, this mightn't seem like a big deal. It is kind of just one person's ramblings, but I think that utopian ideal of the transhuman singularity is actually what underlies most of modern liberal thinking, which may sound a bit weird, But I mean, first off, I think every political ideology obviously has some kind of utopia in mind. But I think what's unique about the modern era is how much people derive their morality from utopian visions, basically. I mean, there are other ways to derive morality. You can have a virtue ethics, like say the Stoics would have had, like the ancient Greeks had. You can have a concept of virtue and what a good person is and how that person should live. You can have a conception of natural law, of dharma, of the right way to do things, of some sort of divinely existing natural order. But really, the only thing that really dominates, and some people have written about this, like Alistair MacIntyre, the death of virtue ethics after virtue, and how the only thing that dominates now are these kind of consequentialist viewpoints, where things are only good insofar as they serve some kind of political end. And obviously, what comes to mind there is Marxism as the perfect example of that. It is this like totalizing worldview where everything is read in terms of class struggle, in terms of the emancipation of the proletariat, where the proletariat and their freedom is given like a spiritual significance, and everything is read in this sort of oppression dialectic. But it doesn't just apply, obviously, to communism. I mean, the same thing can be said of even classical liberals. The same thing can be said of believers in capitalism. It does become, they do take on this religious significance. And for, I think, modern progressivism or radical liberalism, those two things are probably one and the same. I think the utopian vision they have is not the classless society, but is the post-human society. And that is the implicit impetus that's driving modern liberalism. And I think that comes from a couple of things, but it's interesting to ask the connection with Judaism when you look at Pritzker and Rothblatt and Soros, and even you look at like a movie like The Matrix that had a lot of these themes, and again it's the Wachowski sisters who are both have since the making of those movies have transitioned sex, and both are from Jewish backgrounds, and it's much the same themes in that movie as is expressed in Rothblatt's book. Like obviously you can read the Matrix in all these myriad of ways. You can read it in political ways. You can read it in a kind of Gnostic interpretation, but you can certainly see allusions to this ideal of transhumanism and of transcending the material world. And then of course there's all those interests in there's all the interest in symbolism of them trying to make it Zion, and of the Nebuchadnezzar and all these like Old Testament names, and there's certainly an interpretation of it where Neo is Moses and Morpheus is Yahweh, but this transhumanist ideal, I think, is important to understand because, firstly, I mean, it's a fundamental challenge to every preceding morality. If you think about the consequences of it, it's a shift not in morals, it's a shift in metaphysics, because it takes a kind of caricature of a very simplistic sort of dualist way of looking at things, where what you are is no longer has any connection with your body. There's a kind of soft dualism, and then there's this hard dualism where someone can say, well, I'm a female, and that's just true then. It doesn't need to conform to any physical reality anymore. There isn't even a suggestion of that. To suggest that would be to deny someone their identity. Because I mean, if you think about that statement, if you think about a person in a male body saying I'm a female, it's like, well, what does that mean? You're sexually you're not. So what does it mean to say, well, I am because that's my gender? And generally, I mean, the only way this is explained is it's just kind of whatever you feel, but it's not even just a feeling, because if it was a feeling that was separate from the body, and the physical body was another reality, then you could call it a delusion. But obviously, you can't call it that now. So that is the reality now. Identity as connected to anything physical is just being written off now, because again, it's not like this idea of post-human and post-gender. There's no longer any physical reality for it to even conform to. The physical reality stuff is just kind of some accident of biology, and then whatever it is that's behind it is what you actually are. And of course, that's entirely up to your own choice and up to your own whim. And so it's very solipsistic, but it's this extreme like reification of dualism. And again, this is interesting as the utopia of technological civilization for two reasons. One of them is this idea of progress, that it's kind of latent in technological progress. Like, we don't speak out loud anymore what the purpose of all this is, what progress is, what we're heading towards. But implicitly, if you work 40 hours a week, you toil away, and then you have your free time the rest of the week. I mean, implicit in this process is you're kind of working for a mastery over nature, so you can have like free space where you're not determined by the bounds of nature outside of that. So obviously the implicit progress of technological civilization is towards this space of freedom, free from nature's laws. And the technological singularity is kind of the ultimate expression of that. You just become pure consciousness, like uploaded to a USB stick or whatever. But I think it's interesting how Judaism connects to this as well. And you can look at the Wachowskis, you can look at Martin Rothblatt, but you can look at who's the main guy that has been pushing the transhumanism stuff, and it's Ray Kurzweil. And again, transhumanism is a field where people of that background are hugely overrepresented. And they generally are anyway in modern intellectual movements, but transhumanism especially seems to have a place for secular people from this background. And again, you can just say it's general overrepresentation, but it is interesting that you often find people from a background of Judaism attracted to very like extreme utopian movements. Like there's something where if it's like capitalism and it's Ayn Rand or Murray Rothbard, it's not just capitalism. It has to be like extreme capitalism with like no social services, no altruism, just the pure like utopian vision of capitalism. And again, if it's socialism, it has to be like the pure communism of a Karl Marx, or the pure individualist anarchism of some of the early 20th century anarchists. And so there's this tendency to kind of push things to an absolute extreme in terms of the internal logic that's governing that system. And there's also this tendency towards like materialist utopia. And I think that there is a connection with Judaism there, because you look at Judaism, and Judaism was different from other ancient religions and different from paganism in a number of important ways. But what really characterizes it is this kind of materialist eschatology, or this like materialist apocalyptic vision, where first of all it reifies this dualism that's present in the transhumanist movement. It reifies this absolute separation of body and soul. The afterlife in Judaism is someone's soul separates from their body, and then at the end times the body and soul will be reunited, and the dead will rise. And the Jewish vision of the end times of heaven is heaven on earth, and it's like infinite time of living materially comfortably on earth in your body. So there's no transcendence of the ego. There's no afterlife in some higher sense. It's a materialist creed. It's a materialist religion. This was like a criticism that Schopenhauer made of the Old Testament a lot. It's this materialist creed. Like in all of the Eastern religions, there's a desire for transcendence and a desire for escape from this cycle of pleasure and pain, and a desire for something beyond the individual self. what Hindus would call the jiva, which is like the individual personality, the personality traits, the kind of person you are that's made through experiences and so on. And then there's the Atman, which is like the pure consciousness, the soul, that absolute subjectivity that is equated with God, and basically the purpose is to realize the temporal nature of the jiva, and to realize that you're not the jiva, that fundamentally your nature is the Atman, and Atman is Brahman, and then you experience oneness and escape the suffering of death and rebirth. But Judaism is very different. In Judaism, you are the jiva. There's no Atman to speak of at all. You are the jiva. You're put here by God. You're kind of thrown into nature. And again, this thrownness is interesting because it's very much in contrast to paganism. Paganism kind of reveres the natural processes and ecological harmony. Again, you can think of something like in Hinduism, they have the allegory of like Indra's net, and Indra's net is in the story is like a spider's web, and there's bits of water on the interlocking parts of the web, and they all reflect each other, and then all the reflections reflect each other, and all of these ways of trying to express that beyond the apparent duality, there's an ultimate oneness and interconnected, like a holographic nature to reality and to experience that we miss. There's none of this in Judaism. In Judaism, it is this dualistic world. There is the material world and there is God, and you are put there as a soul into a body, and afterwards you will leave the body. And if you're pure, if you're clean, if you've studied God's laws well enough, you'll go to this abode of heaven, and eventually you'll come back into the body. But it's very much God is very much something separate from the world. There's no notion of like the kind of pantheism or panentheism that you see in Eastern religion. Again, in paganism, there's a reverence for life, for the processes that give birth to life. You can think of like fertility, celebrations of fertility, and rituals around that, and gods and goddesses that represent things like fertility, that represent natural processes. And that pagan spirit is very much like being in the present, whether it's going into battle, or working with the land, whatever it is. It's all about the immediacy of being in and with the natural world. And with Judaism, you don't get that. With Judaism, you get abstraction. It's about studying the laws. It's about even think of all the cleansing rituals. Think of something like circumcision, which is really kind of a rejection of that sense of the person as a natural phenomenon, as coming out of the world rather than being thrown into it. The fact of circumcision shows that ultimately nature has made this person sort of born imperfect, and again it's this covenant with something that's outside of nature. And it's there in the Old Testament. I mean, the book of Genesis, I think God tells Adam to go forth, and one of the words used is subdue the earth. So there's none of this, there's no pantheism, there's no like sort of God abides in everything, mystical element of things. And you can even see the difference, like the Old Testament God and New Testament God. A New Testament God is very much more, let rain fall on anyone good and evil. And the Old Testament God gets directly involved in history. The Old Testament God has a will. And so what's really different about Judaism is, first of all, this capacity for abstraction that it gives its members, and that it encourages. And you can see this in the Jewish capacity for irony and comedy, because that's ultimately what irony is the capacity to abstract and make objective things that we normally take for granted in the immediacy of engaging them. And then once something is abstracted, you can present a kind of dissonance between the abstraction and the felt experience of being engaged in it, and that dissonance is cause for humor. And so Judaism very much has that tendency to abstract and to look at the world and nature as something separate. And kind of a hostile, fearful approach to nature. And what's really important is the approach to time, because again, God interferes in the world, God has a will. But most importantly, and what really separates Judaism from other religions, is the fullness of God and God's purpose is tied up in time. And the entire religion is about the end times, it's about moving towards the end times. This historicism that you don't see in any other religion. I mean, Zoroastrianism has like an end time showdown between good and evil, but it doesn't have in the same way this personal theistic individual God that like actually gets involved in the process of nature and like makes this stuff happen. And it doesn't have like a chosen people that are sort of along for this ride. So it's quite unique in that way. I mean, you can look if you read someone like Evola or Ganon, they always characterize tradition and ancient religions as being built around the idea of cyclical time. You see it in Hinduism with the doctrine of the four yugas, the golden age, and you eventually move to Eteric age, but then back to a golden age. Same kind of thing in Buddhism, same kind of thing in most Eastern religions. There isn't really this idea of an end times. And so Judaism is, like, what is really unique about Judaism is the fact that it ties ultimate importance to the progress of history. And it really solidifies the idea of progress. Everything is bound up with the idea of the progress of the Jewish people and obeying God's law. And it's ultimately about will as well. The will is being something outside of nature. And so you should make your will conform to the divine will so that you can move to this ultimate end, which is this sort of, again, materialist utopia. And you can extend that, and you can look at other movements in terms of modern utopian movements, and you can look at someone like Karl Marx or Ayn Rand, and instead of the will conforming to divine will that's handed down through Jewish law and so on, and now the divine will conforms to the progress of history, which is dialectical materialism, which is to move towards a classless society, or you can see it as the unfolding of freedom, like classical liberals look at it. And you can see it in the case of transhumanism as the ultimate progress towards complete emancipation from nature and from what it is to be human, complete emancipation from the human itself towards transhumanity or post-humanity. And really the singularity, the idea of the transhumanist singularity is maybe the most similar, the best, the most easily extrapolated from the Jewish conception of the end times. In that it's, the Jewish conception of the end times is, again, like complete emancipation from nature. You'll have everlasting life. You won't have to fear death. Death will be done away with. You'll have ultimate protection from God, and you'll live in paradise on earth. And you can look at transhumanism as a technological version of that. You get to transcend death and live in this community for all times, and you've completely escaped the bounds of nature. So, I think Judaism is really significant in this way, and all of these things, like the linear progression of time, the ultimate dualism of Judaism, the ultimate division of the conscious subject, maybe called soul in Judaism, but now it's just in our modern materialist understanding, they just see it as the mind that can be unplugged and put in a USB stick. But this fundamental dualism, where what you are is fundamentally separate from nature and not bound to nature's laws. You're not your body. You are this absolute subject. And this historicism, where the good is kind of derived from your role in bringing about this end of history, and also the kind of, I think the kind of givenness of Judaism is interesting, like the nominalist aspect, where there's however many laws, like 619 laws that Jews have to obey, and basically they have to obey them because they're given by God. There's no absolute end. As in, it's not something that can be, like the Vedas in Hinduism. The idea would be that, well, you could derive them yourself, if you went up to the mountains and got enlightened, that you'd kind of discover all this truth for yourself. It's perennial, Same with Buddhism, like anyone can go and meditate under a lotus tree and become enlightened. And it's just various people sort of retelling this ultimate truth in various ways, and there's various exoteric expressions of that, and it is timeless in that sense. But not with Judaism. Judaism is something that's handed down in time. It's not something that can be discovered by direct experience. And you see this kind of doubt in the Old Testament the whole time. Like you can think of even when Moses comes down with when he comes down with the commandments, and they're back worshipping calves, they're like back doing polytheism again. And he's just like, they've already like lost faith. But there's very little direct communication with the divine. I mean, through the prophets there is whatever. But it's this kind of givenness. There's no investigation beyond just I am who I am. As God identifies himself at the burning bush to Moses, I am who I am, or I am that I am. So there's this kind of lack of direct experience with the divine. Again, it's very much something that's handed down, and the whole religion really is very much law-based. Morality is kind of equated to following these prescribed laws, but again, they're not. It's not like virtue ethics where everyone can look at, well, how should a man behave in this situation, and everyone kind of has a sense of virtue ethics. Everyone kind of has a sense of natural law, but not so much with the sort of codified morality of Judaism. And again, I think it's this sort of dualistic, anti-naturalist way of looking at things. And of all the religions, Judaism is probably the most difficult to derive a kind of ecological consciousness from. And you'll even find, like, if you try and look up sort of Jewish contributions to ecology, you'll even see them sort of making this admission that it's not possible to have anything beyond a kind of sense of like stewardship of the earth, but ultimately you're kind of protecting the earth for the chosen people, and because like God has given it to you to be stewards of. It's not this sort of ecological interconnectedness that you find in other religions. So Judaism as a foundation for modernity kind of has all the seeds there in terms of historicism, in terms of progressivism, in terms of this kind of millenarianism, this eschatology that ends with a materialist heaven on earth. You can say like, yeah, it's not Judaism if you take God out of it. But at the same time, you can have an identical kind of eschatology, just without the sort of divine intervention of Yahweh. But you can still have this eschatology where the ultimate purpose of life and of the earth is derives from this endpoint of material wellness and the ultimate conquering of nature. Like I think it was Vogelin wrote that book about philosophy, science, and Gnosticism, and he said that he's a Catholic writer, and he wrote that the heresy of today was Gnosticism, and that things like Marxism and liberalism were retelling of the Gnostic heresy, where the material or the actual existing world was taken as somehow evil in a fallen state, and that it could be perfected by some elite by bringing about some absolute end. But I mean, this really it really fits with Jewish eschatology quite well. Even Gnosticism is different. I mean, in Gnosticism, there's at least a kind of drive for transcendence, and it's much more sort of perennialist in that sense. But in terms of pure Judaism is this kind of extended egotism. It's the individual out to the tribe, and then the tribe out to the God of the tribe, and then ultimately the God of the tribe is made the only God of monotheism, and so the people become the chosen people of God. So it is this kind of, again, to look at Schopenhauer's criticism, it is this kind of extended egotism where there's no drive for transcendence. And that's not to say that the whole of modernity is informed by this aspect of Judaism coming from whatever Judeo-Christianity, but it is to say that within technological civilization, as you have again this emancipation from nature, and you have the destruction of traditional values, and you have this constant sort of decoding and deconstruction of traditional morality, and the ultimate destruction of virtue, and now we have no conception of virtue, ethics, or natural law. A space has to fill that morality there, and a space has to fill religion. And you know, if you think of the important role religion fills in dealing with death and having a conception of an afterlife and making suffering on the earth worthwhile, then transhumanism and the singularity really is it is a substitute for religion. It's not even, it is a religion in itself. And well, not everyone will profess to being a transhumanist that believes in the singularity. I think implicitly it really is the utopian vision that drives all of the modern radical liberal progressivist movement, really. You know, class and all this stuff matters less and less. It's not about emancipating the proletariat anymore with the what gets called cultural Marxist, with the radical liberal types, the people that are hung up on critical race theory and gender ideology and stuff. It's really not about class emancipation, dealing with injustices anymore. It is fundamentally about transcending gender, transcending race, transcending any inborn identity. And implicit in that is this move towards the post-human, towards the transhuman singularity, and it is very tied up with the whole eschatology of Judaism, the whole eschatology of a kind of materialist, progressivist utopia that history is unfolding towards. I think that the singularity is like the perfect sort of materialist retelling of that originally fundamentally Jewish understanding of the world. So it is interesting to see people like the Wachowskis creating art around this scenario. It's interesting to see Martine Rothblatt laying out a manifesto for this. It's interesting to see people like Jennifer Pritzker and George Soros putting so much funding behind activism for this kind of thing, because as much as Ayn Rand's vision of utopia, the individualist utopia, as much as Karl Marx's vision of the classless society, as much as these kind of fit the traditional sort of Jewish vision of utopia, where it's universalist, it's kind of timeless, you know, once it's instituted, that's kind of the end of history, that we've ultimately progressed to that. It's the extreme telling of some principles, where that principles like individual freedom or principles underlying socialism, they're taken to their absolute extreme. You know, these are all the things that characterize these utopian movements traditionally. You know, the materialism, the historicism, the way it can be sort of codified into one principle, like the non-aggression principle, class emancipation, whatever else. And transhumanism really fits all of that perfectly. You know, it's scientism-made religion, so obviously it has the materialist aspect. It has this way of looking back at history where everything was originally, whether we knew it or not, heading towards this ultimate end goal of the singularity. All technology, all human progress was heading towards this, ultimately conquering death and creating the singularity. And again, it has this sort of universalist aspect where not only will we not have racism and anti-Semitism, not only will race be transcended, but gender will be transcended. Ultimately, the being connected to a body at all will be transcended. Nature will be completely transcended and will be in the post-human. So, I don't know what the point of this was. I don't know if anyone will find this helpful. But I do think that there's, if I can lay this out as simply as possible, I do think that there's, behind every morality, behind every political ideology people have now, there's some unspoken vision of a utopian endpoint of history. For Marxism it's classless society, but I think for liberalism, for radical liberals, for most of what we're seeing in the West now with the critical race theory, the gender ideology, it's this utopia of the transhumanist singularity, and that's intimately bound up with a Jewish conception of ontology, eschatology, and historicism, which is very much really the opposite worldview of the traditionalist perspective on time and on ontology, and the complete opposite of the European pagan conception of harmony and cyclical time. And that's interesting, and I think that's why it shows why this transgender movement is so important, because it's not just a statement of morals, it's a statement of metaphysics, and it's about fundamentally transforming identity and a fundamental rejection of any conception of virtue or natural law, which are things that are always connected with what one is. You know, natural law, in the simplest sense, is that things should be the fullness of their being, and you know, an intellectual should be the best intellectual, a man should be the best kind of man, but morality always derives from what you are, and you know, goodness is being what you are. And this new transhumanist morality that's outlined by these people is the total rejection of that. And it is at bottom incoherent, but it does inspire this this religious fervor in its believers that we're seeing across the West now.